and I suspect recording in process.
Yes.
There
Now
will be
we're
a couple more coming to join us as we get going, but I'd like to particularly extend a warm welcome to Dr. Maranda Turner from George Fox and Dr. Jen Kleiber from Corban University, and they're going to be presenting, like I shared in the chat, the introduction, the overview, innovation through gamification. And again, a topic that I was introducing kind of the concept to our first year teacher education candidates at Redeemer, and it was just neat to see the eyes light up when you mention this topic. And so I think we're on to something important. I know Scott has done some really neat work in this area as well. And so certainly I'm really excited, looking forward to hearing from this and at the conference as well. So thank you for being here. I'll turn it over to you. I'll just to kind of let everyone know, I will serve as a facilitator for the dialogue as it emerges. And so if we're in a Q&A session, if you can raise your physical hand or your virtual hand, and I'll kind of cue the sequence of speakers as we go, but I'll try to be as unobtrusive as I can. Thanks, Jen and Miranda. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, good morning. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to start talking about gamification as innovation. It's a really exciting topic for me. I was telling Scott this morning that this is really timely because I am actually teaching this game next week in 2 separate sessions, and I teach it in my fall course to my senior undergrads who are doing their student teaching right now. I teach it in the spring to the secondary students and to the grad students. And I've taught it now. I also teach it to an ESOL cohort that are general ed bilingual teachers who work predominantly in a Spanish, English 50-50 model. And so it's something that I'm really excited about and passionate about. It's great to share it with you. I am going to walk us through the ideas behind this. Miranda and I have similar components to our games, yet different ways to make them happen. So let's start off with, first of all, what does it mean to really practice gamification, and how does it work in the structure of higher ed coursework? As a pedagogical practice, we can attach it to in-task standards, which I'll show you in a moment, and it really becomes this instructional force. I kind of like to think of it as I can build background and we can have really great conversation for our term goes from the end of August and then we end early December. So we've covered a majority of the content in my ESOL methods class for English as a second language instruction. And now we get to sort of put it into practice. We've spent many days talking about what does it look like to be culturally responsive? What does it look like to have empathy? What does equity look like? How do we address our own personal biases? And those kinds of conversations have happened along the way. So as I bring this in as sort of a culminating conversation to those ideas, it becomes very, very powerful as an instructional tool. It serves student engagement, and Miranda can talk about this in her game as well. Our students are highly invested. Anytime you put a game in front of students, I don't know, you could have a 5-year-old to a 95-year-old, and if you are like games, you're going to be invested. And those that are dubious a little bit about gameplay, they get into it because of the way it's paced and the way things roll. And in my game in particular, as I'll talk about, we have some little twists and turns that pull them in and cause them to have to stop and consider new ideas. And then how does it encourage cognitive development? It causes people to really start to have to put together what's my personal worldview and what's my philosophy of education, and how do I meld those into my teacher persona who's going to walk out and engage students in a public school or a private school situation. So we really start to put together, what have I learned? How does this apply to the real world? And then how do I actually take it with me and have it impact my own personal practice in education? That's really exciting work in my book. And so as we talk about common conversations for empathy growth, in this game that I'm going to show you from my end, we really reflect on personal bias and its impact on our role as an educator. We talk about it in looking for the roots of student issues before responding to a student issue. So how do we begin to grow that empathy that says, I need to know why you're acting out, not just simply respond to the behavior that's in front of me. And then we talk about the teacher awareness of those invisible student factors, the things we can't see, the things they're not telling us, and how we can tune into ourselves to tune in as teachers so that, I heard that my screen's not moving. Is that true?
That would be true. While Jen is figuring out what's going on, I will say that this work that Jen and I are engaged in came out of, we both took a class with Scott Headley. And the amazing thing for me about gamification and the systemic issues that we're able to have conversations about with students is that we both took the same course. We both played the same game. It manifests for us in different ways based on the needs of our students and our content. And that to me is extremely exciting, because you could take Jen's game, which she'll talk about. It's a kind of a shorter term game, and you could lay any content over it. And same for my game, even though it's longer. And so this idea that we can have these difficult, empathetic conversations about individual needs and differences, understanding how the choices that I make impact me as a player, how the choices that Maranda makes impact me as a teacher, are really powerful in terms of helping students see there are inadvertent and sometimes intentional barriers that inhibit children from success in our system. And as soon as students can start to have honest dialogue about that, they can start to engage in conversations about what will be within my sphere of influence and what will be things that will be outside of what I can influence. And what do I do with both of those things? And so that's been a really powerful element of this use of role play games for us, even though Jen and I, inspired by Scott, use our game in very, very different ways.
Thank you, Miranda. I apologize for the tech issues. I think we're back on track now. Thank you for that. So we look at these important factors, and really what it comes down to is we want to also address with our students that there are systemic issues, and being aware of those allows us to be responsive instead of reactive to those. So when we look at our students and we can ask the questions like what it's inhibiting them from being successful, is there something that's in the larger systemic in organizational idea, or is it really just something within their personal environment? And then we want to recognize that there are systems, that are inadvertently set up to disadvantage linguistically diverse students. So this is the middle column here is really where we come together in our games. And then, like Miranda said, we have different ways to implement, and some of our common conversations look a little different. So Miranda sits in empathy in terms of individual differences and understanding the impact of their own choices in their journey in education. And then the acceptance of the impacts of factors that are outside of their control. And really, I can say for both of us, when we meet with our future educators, this idea that they don't have control of everything is sometimes a really hard concept. That's big for them. And they have felt very in control through all of their college experiences, and to find out that things are going to happen that they have no ability to control. And so therefore they have to learn how to respond with hopeful empathy and understanding to their students really is it sometimes a newer concept than I'm sometimes surprised by that, I should say. So let me explain my game momentarily to you. It's called Real Life. So I want you to picture the board game Life with the dial in the middle that decides your entire life as you go through the board game. Mine is an actual board game. I've constructed physical boards, and then I had an experience last year where I had to put it online. So I've played it both as a digital format and in physical face-to-face classes. I enjoyed both. I like the ability to sit around a board and really interact face-to-face, but I am continuing to work and build the digital side so that I can use it in any format based on who I'm playing with and how we want to engage in that. So this real life game is designed to explore personal perspectives of empathy and equity in the general education classroom. The course outcomes, like I said, they can go back to our in-task standards about learner development and learning differences. And we also have a framework of dispositions at Corban University that talk about teaching for transformation and community engagement and leadership. And so we are able to put those frameworks in as well. This is an example of the cards. So these are physical cards that students get. When you look at the character card, that is who they become for the game. They play as Olivia. I have about 12 different characters. They all have the exact same categories. And then these numbers along the side are what denote how they interact with the rest of the game. So you notice that there's nothing for grit. A student gets to roll for grit, or we can call it perseverance, at the beginning of the game, and then they add that number to their card. Each card is different and represents a different kind of student from a different background. And most of these cards are drawn from my own experiences teaching in diverse communities for 25 years, and then working with others to create what we thought were really good representations of the students in our current communities here in Salem, Oregon. When you look at a life stage card, they have each life stage card will reflect current research on what is known about educational journeys for our students. They go through this game from basically birth through what we call post-college, where they would walk through preschool and elementary school and middle school, but they always have these cards they need to interact with, and they need to roll the dice and then add the factor. So adding their academic factor to this card would only be a 1, and they would need a 7 to move to middle school. That may become an impacting factor for a student playing Olivia, and they'll have to navigate what to do next in terms of moving through the game. And sometimes they get stuck for quite a while. There's lots of interaction with cards that cause them to have to think about their choices and what's keeping them from moving forward. They can use their grit to move forward. They can add grit that they own and move forward. But I have students who they get stuck in elementary school. They may never get out. And that's part of our conversation. What happens to that kid where in real life, they don't get past elementary school? What factors do we know about them, or do we see in their journey that are going to help us understand them better and help us serve our students better? So grit happens. You can experience good and bad things through grit. You can move ahead, you can move back, you might have to redo something. It's one of the little zingers in the game that keeps it really engaging for students because they just don't know what's coming. And at the very end of the game, everybody gets a "this is your life" card. And those are just, the idea of the life cards is to prove to students that you are not defined necessarily by your journey. So if the journey was really tough and you never made it through middle school, that really doesn't mean that you're not going to make it in life. It means that there's more growth to happen, and you can end up being a very successful entrepreneur without having made it through middle school. We don't want to limit our thought processes about what our students can or can't do, but this causes these kinds of conversations to come out within the game. And then the significance of this game is that we really engage in some hard conversations from having this shared experience. We debrief through forums, they debrief with each other, we debrief face to face, and we talk about what their thoughts were and what they experienced, the frustrations or the sort of the feelings that came up as they experienced hardships, or they sailed through and watched their friends struggle and they could do nothing to help them in the game. So participants self-report that they see themselves differently. I had a student one time, this quote was, "I thought I was empathetic, but then I realized I could do more because I got competitive and wanted to, stomp everybody else. I wanted to be the winner." We've had some students come up with some really deep and fascinating connections to their real life experiences. And those are these gems that come out of this gamification idea, this innovation idea. So the next steps for my game are that I continue to evolve it. I change the research every 2 years to make sure it's as current as possible. So when a student gets a card that has research, it's new and it's applicable to the pandemic, or it's applicable to what's happening right now in education. New focuses for the game. This whole idea of who games your game. Dr. Dane Joseph from George Fox brought up this question to me, and I had to think about it. Who's gaming my game? It doesn't matter if you win my game. There is no win. It's just an experience. But who's gaming it, and who's trying to get ahead or adjust or get around through a back door? And that's been a fascinating kind of look for me. And I'm thinking about some future research around that idea. And then goals for a longitudinal study to see if perspective shifts really result in permanent changes for educators. I've brought this game to some principals in a middle school, and we're talking about playing it with their staff and seeing how it impacts conversation and possibly practice within their school. And I'm going to hand it over to Maranda to change voices here, and I'll continue to click and let her speak about her game.
Awesome. Well, like I said, the powerful thing is that in Jen's game, they'll have immediate conversations, and they'll deal with really mean game facilitators who will rock their worlds a little bit, and it can be upsetting to them. They do all eventually forgive, I think, but can be upsetting to them. The work that I do with our game is long-term. And so while we're both creating these really difficult conversations and spaces to have those conversations, difficult roads, you can move the slide, Jen, looks a little bit different in that it is embedded into one of our courses. So at George Fox, undergraduate students receive or earn an ESOL endorsement as a part of their preparation. And so in the How Languages Are Learned course, this game, Difficult Roads, is embedded into the course. And if Jen moves the slide forward, you'll be able to see an example of a card and a player and what students do in the game. So the game, the intent of the game, the purpose, what students are told, the purpose of the game is that you are a 5th grade English language learner, and that your goal is to be able to choose your own electives when you get to middle school. And that in and of itself gives us a really powerful space to have conversations around, well, why would that even be a thing that students would worry about? Why wouldn't students be able to choose their own electives? Those kinds of things. And so much of this game occurs through rolling and different random things that happen to the students, but they do control their responses. And you can see my game format is very simple. It's just a big board with pockets on it. It's not an actual game board that students move around. They have sticks, and you'll see that in some of the future pictures, that they move as they're moving through the game. The reason for that candidly was because when I started using this game, we were kind of bouncing back and forth between, are we face-to-face? Are we hybrid? What are we doing? And so I needed something that I could pick up and carry and quickly move into a virtual setting if I needed to do that. I also needed a way to be able to move my game around because it lasts 10 to 12 weeks, depending on about how long it rolls out. So I obviously can't leave a game set up in a classroom, a game board set up in a classroom that long. So the game is tied to all of the different course objectives, and the pockets, the topics of the pockets are tied into those objectives. And so students engage in a content card. They're just randomly, well, before the game starts, I should say, they do some rolling and some different things to determine what character they will be, whether they'll be male or female, what their heritage language will be, what their English proficiency level is, and these things, some of them occur by drawing, some of them occur by rolling. They don't really have say over the matter, which can be a point of frustration for some students and also a point of excitement for some students. Some students get really intrigued by this idea of they're creating this character within certain parameters as the game is played. So to move through the game, so to move from pocket to get to the elective, the magical elective pocket, students are responding to content cards. And content cards are relatively simple. They're based on some sort of language acquisition or language development research. And then they have to respond from the teacher perspective. So what does this mean for you as a language teacher is a very common question that they answer in response to some sort of prompt. And you can see an example here of students respond, they get a response from me. And once I give them feedback on their card, things can go a couple of different ways. And so We have these things called challenge cards, which is if you have a little oops and potentially you miss the mark or you don't respond or something like that, you can elect to do a challenge card. Challenge cards always heighten the student's obligation in terms of content. They are often things like you have 10 minutes to organize, in this case, the example you see here is a syntax surgery about a particular quote that you'll share with other students, or you're going to come up with 3 images that you can use to explain this principle or this theory and talk about it with the class, those kinds of things. When students do challenge cards, you can move it forward, Jen. When students do challenge cards, they their peers get to decide how well they've articulated or explained something. Every time I've had a student do a challenge card, peers have always been profoundly supportive and encouraging, and it helps move them along in the game. I think because they're realizing, right, someday that'll be me. And I also want peers to be supportive and helpful to me as I'm engaged in a challenge card. One of the things that also happens with challenge cards is that sometimes students elect not to do a challenge card. They'll stay in the same proficiency, the same competency until the following week. And at the end of the game, students will realize that actually set me up. It slowed me down and I wasn't able to do everything that I wanted to do. And we've had some really powerful conversations about this idea of what feels like a safe or good decision at the time can be really challenging when you reach the end of something and you're trying to select your electives. So that's the challenge card side of things. When you have a little hiccup or like, oops, what happens if I don't answer correctly? If students answer their content card fully correct, they move into a factor card. They get to draw a factor card, which helps move the game along and helps them earn these little dots as you see on the sticks here. So players hold on to their character card throughout the game because they're constantly adding details like whether the student's a long-term English learner, how many speakers of that same heritage language are in the school, all those kinds of things, because these are all things that impact the play of the game. And so we just track their game with these highly technological little sticks and colored dots. But, elementary education majors love stickers. So really it works okay, because students will say, can I have, how do I get a second sticker? Well, you gotta roll one in a factor card. So I was talking about this earlier, this idea that I'm sure you're starting to envision, oh, I could put any content in here and play this way. You absolutely could. Any content that requires some sort of character or player in the game that your students, that your players can get empathetic behind, you can use this type of format, this type of game for. It's not complicated at all. Ultimately, in the end, students get to select an elective card. And the last time I played the game, students told me, you really need to start talking up the elective cards about 2 weeks before we're going to draw electives, because they started to get really excited and started to want to try to move faster through the game and to accomplish more in the game, to answer more questions, to do more challenges, those kinds of things. And what happens that students don't realize in the game is that the elective cards are set with certain parameters on them. So you can earn points all through the game. You're earning, 2 or 5 or whatever points. And when you get to the elective pocket, there will be things on the elective that say things like, in order to be eligible for this elective, you must have a certain heritage language, or you must have a certain English proficiency level, or you must, and it helps us enter into conversations about, I had a young man who was very angry with me. I did everything right. I answered a content card every week. I did well. I had positive factor cards every week. Yeah, I still could only choose from 3 electives. Like, how is this possible? And it allows us to engage in conversations about, well, how might that be similar to an experience that one of your students might be having as a 5th grader looking out towards middle school? And so thanks, Jen, for moving that forward. Yeah. So for me, the takeaway and the reflection, and they have conversations with each other, and then they have a written dialogue with me. The power in the game is that they start to recognize that their educational journey, their students' educational journey, is just as much about their individual needs and their individual choices as it is about the structure of things that may be blocking them or preventing them from being able to move forward. And so I think it's on the next slide, Jen. Students start talking about things like there are so many factors that we have to be mindful of when we serve English learners. Yep, there are so many things that we need to consider, right? And no matter how many different ways I've tried to make illustrations or make infographics or create slide decks or have students present on this topic, this game is what finally led students to articulate things like, the things my students struggle with might be the same or might be different than the things that I have struggled with as a student, because our experiences are different, our roads to education were different. And so that piece has been, for me, the true power in using a role play game over a long period of time. Students really invest in their character. They, they want them to be successful. They recognize that choices that they make in the game impact what will happen to their character, all of those kinds of things. And so I hope that getting to hear a little about a couple of different ways that we have used this innovation called role play or gamification kind of helped you think about, there are lots of ways this could look in higher education. And it's really exciting because it can go 1,000 different ways. Like I said, Jen and I embarked on this journey because we had a shared experience in Scott's class, yet where we've gone with it is very different. So hopefully in our conversation, we can also think about, each of you will take this so many different directions in the different work that you do with faculty or with students or, with in-service teachers. So thanks for letting us talk a little bit about games and how it has helped us have conversations about empathy and just things that are really challenging to get at unless you can get some buy-in and some real, so that students see a real need for those conversations.
And I just want to reiterate what Miranda said so eloquently, which is, this is where students, like, it just explodes. They get it. And all of a sudden they have so many more questions and so many more thoughts. And the hard part is doing it towards the end of the term. We can only explore those so much before they move on, and I don't have them anymore. So I've actually moved it up in the term, so we have more time to debrief even past the formal debrief sessions, because this is truly where they start talking about, remember when we played that game? I saw that in my kid in my classroom, and teachers coming back for second year teachers are saying, I see that game in real life, and that's the name. Like, so it's powerful innovation, and it's exciting, and it does take a little bit of work, but it's worth it. So questions or comments or thoughts? We're always looking for thoughts to keep going.
Let me set the stage for that, Jen. And Jen and Miranda, thank you so much. You can see we've got about a half hour or so for discussion, and then we'll get a chance to thank you at the end of that. It's a powerful piece for me. Again, I really appreciate it. I had an opportunity to watch Scott's game in action a couple of years ago. I wasn't playing. The introvert in me wanted me to just sit in the background and watch. And actually, that was an amazing and fascinating experience because of the emotional investment of the participants. It was incredible. And they'd all played the game before, and yet still were emotionally involved in what they were doing. And just the power of character-based dialogue that came out of that was just incredible to watch. Like, it really, really was. And I think the piece that struck me the most, and I really appreciate, I want to reiterate that piece too, is the idea of developing a strategy that you can use again, but change the content. And it's such an essential skill for a teacher. And again, you both made that point, and your games lend themselves to that. And I certainly appreciate that. But let's open the floor to questions. I think we're small enough that if you simply unmute yourself, maybe put up your hand to prompt us that we know you're going to speak, and then we'll kind of unmute ourselves and go ahead and raise questions or add comments.
I just want to say, Sean, you will play Rockville the next time.
I will.
So I have a question related to what Sean just said. Do you have students who are reluctant to play, and what are some of their reasons for that, and how do you work with those students?
We're looking at each other. Jen, I'll
I know.
defer to short term first, and then I'll talk about my long term.
I know we're like trying to eye each other. I do. We play in small groups, which helps. So we break my group of 20 to 30 up into groups of 5. They come in, they each have their own game master. So they really are, they become a little island of their own, which actually helps those who tend to feel a little bit quieter to engage. And then what I notice when I get to be the observer, if I'm not being a game master, I walk around and just take notes and I just listen and observe. And what I've noticed is my quietest students start off very, very quiet. They just roll, they sit back, they don't want to engage. But what happens is they can't help themselves as the twists and turns start to come. They just feel the need that they either have to, they rarely speak up for themselves, I'm going to say, but what they do is they comment on others' journeys because it's a little bit safer to comment on someone else's journey than their own. But their reflections are often very deep because they've spent the time observing. And so while there's no forcing within the game for them to be an extrovert or to be really high volume, they are engaged and thinking and processing. And so I found them to be some of my best reflectors in the end. Miranda?
Yeah, our game is a little different in that I generally don't have students who say they don't want to play. I mean, they realize it's a part of the course, but they will really underplay it at first. And they'll just be like, nah, whatever, I don't mind, because they aren't competing with each other. They aren't really in Jen's game either, but you don't recognize that until a little further into the game. They aren't really competing against each other as much as they're working against the system that has been built within the game. And so at first, I'll have students saying, I don't mind, I'll just stay in the pocket for a while. And then they start to realize, oh, people who have figured out how to really maneuver inside this game, they're moving several pockets ahead of me. And then they start to think about, is it my own choice that's keeping me from moving, or is it something that's occurring in the game? And those are fun conversations to have as well. The other thing that I will say, Linda, in response to your question, is I had a student who I thought I just could not get into the game. And I was like, well, you can't win them all, right? Like, whatever. The day it was elective day was like, student was 100% bought in and had just been really downplaying like how important they felt the game was and playing in the game. And when the student could not select the elective that they had been working for because they didn't have the right color of dots, it was exciting in that we got to have this really powerful conversation as a class about, well, the dots can represent all sorts of things, experiences, background knowledge, classes that you were or weren't allowed to take, all sorts of things, right? And how much control does a 5th grader have over those things, yet that impacts what they can do moving into middle school. And again, I thought that student was completely like not bought into the game and was like just jumping through hoops because it's a part of the course and whatever. No, he was quite passionate about the game when it came to the end of the game. And so sometimes I think we capture students in ways that we don't quite expect or ways that we don't recognize until we're reaching the end of gameplay. And I fully agree with Jen that sometimes students say things in their ongoing reflections that kind of knock your socks off. And you're like, wow, I've been wishing that students would say this, and now here they're saying it, and we can use their words to dialogue with each other instead of the same voice trying to engage in those conversations over and over again.
Thanks, Jen and Miranda. I really appreciate you sharing your work. This is such an important topic, and it's really great that you have jumped in and tried something and started some conversations. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how your games will continue to develop. I have 2 thoughts, or things that I'm wondering about. I wonder first around the use of gender in both of your games. And I wonder if you have thought about students who might be dealing with gender dysphoria, or who have experience with LGBTQ. And I wonder, like, how does that play into your game? And do you open up conversations in that regard? And the second thought I had was around the way you use race in your games. and you identify people of different races. And how, within your games then, do you ensure that you're not creating stereotypes, but rather the conversations that you're having are actually honoring of different cultures and different races?
Thanks, Edith. I'll take that for start off, because you've picked up on two things that are intentional and purposeful in my game. And one is the diverse population, whether it be how people view themselves, gender. So I have throughout all of my character cards, we have just about every possibility. We don't hold to just one idea or thought there. So we have a very diverse option for characters, and that's intentional because we want to reflect the communities that are in our schools, and we're here to really open our students' eyes to the students that they'll be working with. And so having those hard conversations of what do they whatever their personal worldview is on those things, how do they respect and honor those that they serve in the classroom? So those are addressed in the cards. The question of race was something that too, I've had several conversations with different game masters. I invite different people to be game masters. Miranda's been a game master. Scott has been an observer with me. I have other colleagues, and I've had principals come in and be game masters, which are the people who run the small groups. And we talk about what the cards hold and how that reflects the idea of diversity and honoring all diversity that way. So in terms of the race, we went through and we thought, how can we write these cards and not have them be diminutive or be expanding a stereotype, but to really try to just give an impression of who this character is and maybe where they've come from. And so that's been a real consideration. And every time I go back, every year, about this time of year, I go back into my card set and I go back into my characters and I go back into the research that I have on those life event cards, and I reassess everything that's written and say, am I being representative of not only who's in our schools, the people in our communities, but am I doing so in a way that's honoring and not diminishing or perpetuating an idea? So that is very much on the forefront. And sometimes we look at something, I think, oh, I think I did pretty good, and I'll go back and go, I need to change that, or I need to adjust that wording. And so it's a constant reflective process on my part as I look at the game. I hope that kind of addresses that for you. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I really appreciate the question, because there is this constant tug of like, where do I put my emphasis and where do I put my focus, right? And so in Difficult Roads, the diversity focus is on language, heritage language background. And so we have fewer conversations about race in terms of how race or even how gender might impact the players. And that's intentional, right? I work with sophomore education students, and I needed to find a way to have a conversation about linguistic diversity and how that linguistic diversity is going to impact the students that they serve. And so there are spaces in the game where students think it will matter what gender they are in the game or things like that. It does not come into play in the game. I think sometimes students, and to use Jen's quote, who think they're going to try to game the game, think, oh, it would be better if I'm male, or it would be better if I'm this, or it would be better if I identify in this way. That piece does not impact students, players in the game. Their heritage language will impact them. Their proficiency level in the heritage language and in English will impact their play in the game. But I intentionally had to figure out, how do I create something that doesn't focus on those things, because I wanted the conversations to be around how do we support students with linguistic diversity, as opposed to engaging in important but not within the scope of this course work around how do we engage with conversations with students and families about gender or race or these other factors that you're bringing up. And it was a hard decision. And when I play the game again this spring, I'm going to have that same agonizing, like, does this still work to focus on this narrow aspect of diversity in order to engage in these conversations? And I don't know Jen's experience, but I did note some students starting to make those links, right, to other things, to other factors outside of linguistic diversity, or outside of the number of years that, I've been trying to learn English, or those kinds of things. And so there are some natural places there, but it is intentional in my game to try to minimize those, so that our conversations are focused on something that they likely won't discuss otherwise in any other course.
Yeah, no, that's fair for sure. Can't do it all. Thank you very much.
I'll comment on that as well from my perspective. The game I use is used with doctoral students who are mid-level professionals in schools and universities. And I didn't think much about that going in, but I think it was the last time we played the game, there was a character that was really developed in a stereotypical way by one of our players. And there were several other students that were really upset about that. And they contacted me. This was a 2-day game. We had a part A and a part B. And they contacted me at the end of part A and said, we don't like the way that this person is playing this character. It's too stereotypical. Well, that's the most kind of in my face example of people being upset about it. I wasn't particularly upset, and I thought actually he kind of moderated it a bit on the second day, but it did make me go back and look at some of the reflections that people had written over the years playing the game. And it did come up that part of the struggle that my students have with adopting this character is, and they really spent a lot of time developing the character. That's a big component of the game. That some of them found it very difficult to become the character because they had no natural connection to that person. Like we had a school superintendent that was an autistic young boy, and he, I thought, did a really admirable job of assuming that persona, but it was really hard to communicate with him just as far as gameplay. But I thought, hey, he's doing the best he can, but he told us later about his discomfort in adopting, say, stereotypical behaviors representing this boy, but that's the best he could do. So I think it's an important issue, but I think, as both Jen and Maranda have said, the real power in this comes after the game's over, because then you really have the fertile ground to engage your students with, what does this mean? How did it feel? What are you going to do about it now? What could be done differently? And those are questions I think that Maranda pointed out, is it's sometimes really hard to get students to make those connections. And to get them to that point, then at least they're starting to grapple with things that they're going to be grappling with throughout their career.
And in relation, Edith, going back to this diversity question, the interesting thing is when I created my first round of characters, I created a character that was pretty innocuous to me, just represented a middle class kind of student. Steve was his name. Steve has inadvertently, when we assigned numbers to his categories, inadvertently, Steve has become the ringer of the game. Like if Steve's in the mix, his numbers are going to get him further in the game faster. And that was unintentional in creation. And I haven't changed it yet. I've kept it as the ringer because it promotes so much discussion amongst the students. And then I confess to them at the end that he was not created to be a ringer. And isn't that just like life? That there are people who we see and we go, how are they getting through? And how are they making leaps and bounds and getting so far ahead of the rest of us? What have they got that I don't? And we start to then do this compare and contrast of our own lives against others. And we talk about the danger of even doing that in terms of negative compares and contrast. And then we talk about how can we use the gifts we've been given to serve others in different ways. So Steve becomes this real hotbed of conversation, totally unintentional, but totally worth keeping in the game because he gets a lot of ire, and then we start really talking about what that means. So sometimes little mistakes like that turn out to be real gifts in these conversations.
Yeah. And I think along those same lines, we don't have that kind of intensity because our game is stretched out over such a long period of time. But conversations that are happening are things like when a student is given a heritage language, they spin for a heritage language, and then they roll a die to determine the number of speakers of that heritage language in their school community. And it has opened lots of conversations around, well, what are the benefits of being in a community where there are 100 speakers of that language? What are the benefits of being in a community where there are 5 speakers of that language? And also talking about the challenges that come within that as well. So it doesn't directly address your question, but it does allow us to have conversations about there's great power in diversity of experience, and our students are going to bring so many assets into our classrooms that we don't recognize and we don't know about unless we intentionally reflect on them and process through, this student is bringing so much with them. How do I celebrate those things? And the game doesn't necessarily do that. The game is pretty cut and dry, but they start having those conversations. And that to me is worth, weeks and weeks of buildup and gameplay to get them to that point, to get them to have that conversation.
So to keep the conversation going, Miranda and Jen, what are the biggest surprises that emerged through the process?
I'm glad to share a surprise, but my surprise actually comes from Jen's game. I did experience some surprises with my own students in terms of, there was a particular week when we had to skip a week just because of time and schedules and anything, and they were like, no, it's game time. We're supposed to be doing our game right now. And I was like, oh, I got you now, right? Like, so that was surprising to me, of like how quickly and deeply students bought into the game. But the biggest surprise for me, and where I have been really thoughtful about my own game, is in being a game facilitator for Jen. We had a situation with a student where the student was doing something in the game and didn't like my response as the facilitator. And he said, in my real life, I would just walk away. Like, I would not play a game that was this unfair or stilted, or Jen, I don't remember the exact adjective.
He says, I don't like engage with mean people, is what he said.
I'm not doing this game. And I said, but in real life, your students can't walk away. And he went ashen, and I don't think he said another word the rest of the game. I mean, and that for me was like, this experience might be the first time that students have put on the shoes of somebody else to recognize, I can't always walk away from, work my way out of, fix a situation that I don't have control over. And that was really surprising for me, in terms of thinking about, one, am I a mean person? I'm not a mean person. I'm just a mean game facilitator. But really thinking about that idea of, how do we get more experiences like this in front of our students so that they can recognize sometimes they're going to be viewed as the mean person, but also sometimes students and families are in situations that they can't change. And just the recognition of, like, some students don't realize that yet was really a huge surprise for me.
And that's Miranda being game master was one of the highlights of having that conversation. That student actually reflected for 3 days, was in my office with tears saying, what happened? I think surprises within the game are the emotions that come out when people are faced with unintentional or unknown bias in themselves. And it sort of starts to bubble up as they walk through this game. And I had a girl one day, super sweet, bubbly girl, and she was being highly competitive. She's an athlete, and she took this on as I got to win. And she ended up yelling at a friend of hers at the table, you are never going to get out of middle school. You are never going to make it. And she all of a sudden just stopped and went, what did I just do? And her reflection for the next few days was, I became someone that was so ugly, and I didn't know that was me. I didn't know that my competitiveness could drive me to be so mean. And so that was one thing. In my game, Game Masters, there's an unwritten rule. So the students get a rule sheet of how to play the game. But it says in one sentence, Game Masters are free to do basically as they wish. And so I encourage Game Masters to throw in things that are unexpected, or to hand out good or bad experiences as they feel it would impact the conversation, because there's never a time where it's really silent in the gameplay. People are always commenting on each other's work. I think another impactful surprise was when we were playing this with teachers in the classroom, a bilingual teacher, and they began to play, and their character was struggling. And all of a sudden I just started listening. This student, he started comparing the struggle of his student to his own struggle as a second language learner coming into education. And Scott was observing with me on this one, and it was just like goosebumps, because you realized he suddenly made this deep connection to his own journey. And then his response was, now I need to go back. And like he started reflecting on how he could even be more empathetic to that student situation now that he recognized himself in it. It was very deep and very powerful. And those kinds of conversations never cease to surprise me. I've never had a student walk away saying they wish they hadn't done it, it was a waste of our instructional time. Never. In fact, that's usually the opposite. That's why I've moved it up in the term, because they want more time to engage in the conversations around it. So the surprising piece is it continues to speak to class after class, and each class that plays it is a different group, a different cohort. So it's powerful in that. And I think that's why I keep it going, because the work is big and exciting and really invigorating for me to have deep conversations with students about ways they can be the best educator in the field and serve their students the best. And that's really my goal as my educator self, to prepare them to serve their students to the best of their ability. And this just helps get there.
Thank you, Jen and Miranda. Just really exciting to hear the creation of these games, your heart behind it, and just what you just said, Jen, was so beautiful. My research background is in transformative learning, so I'm picturing the measurements through this whole experience with the dialogic discourse and what actually shifts in their perspectives, and it's really marvelous. And I'm curious, Miranda, with your focus around the metalinguistics, I get that focus, which is fantastic, and I look forward to talking with you further about that. I'm wondering, Jen, around, there's so much awareness around having a trauma-informed approach, that if there's any thread of how to address the emotional and trauma factors with the students.
That's a great question. That's my background as an educator and a behavior specialist, was working with students of trauma and being trained in some of those ideas. So a lot, like I said, I guess I go back to those three really points of purpose in this gaming, is to address that each student comes with things, and we might not understand those things. Some are invisible factors. Not all trauma is seen, but we want to look at the root of each issue. So if I respond to a student or react to a student without looking for the root of the issue, I'm not serving the student well. And that goes back to my trauma background, is if there's a behavior or a reaction to something from a student, often there's a root there. It's rarely done out of thin air. Whether the root is I'm not good enough, or this is too hard, or I'm already at my level of coping. So this game really talks about how do, like the example on the card, Olivia, she's a foster child. So in dealing with the numerous children we have in the care system in our classrooms, how do we look at that as something to be mindful of, something to recognize as a root that's going to perpetuate different kinds of behaviors possibly, or different ways that they might connect with me as a teacher. Their relationship connections might be different because they live in a care system. So we talk about all of that as we play those characters out, and we share with each other who our characters are, what they're bringing in, and that those conversations become very important. It's not just about language or your genetic makeup. It's about what you bring and what your life experiences have been. And we as teachers have to be so mindful and aware that every student's bringing something, and we don't know what that is. And we need to have that relationship in order to serve them well. So does that kind of get at what you were
Yes,
thinking?
I mean, and I'm curious if there's any pathway, the whole concept of teacher being, therapist, counselor, mental health worker, all of these pieces, and in encouraging them to be cognizant of all those things and how to support a student versus directing them towards greater support, directing them towards counseling, directing them towards, or the family itself. I'm just curious if there's any pathway, and maybe that's too expansive. I don't know.
No. For our course sequences, the students that I play with this with as seniors have taken classroom management as juniors, and I'm also the classroom management teacher. So I get to really tie in all of these methods together. And in classroom management, thank you, we spend an enormous amount of time on trauma-informed practices and how do we know when it's not our job anymore and we need to get them the extra resources. So they bring all of that with them into this context of how to serve diverse populations. So that is a nice connection, but it is covered in another course.
That's great.
I think that's a great point to make a transition to Scott to wrap things up. But from my end, Jen and Miranda, I hope I see something coming the way of the journal at some point coming out of this, because this is very, very rich. So Scott, over to you. You're muted still.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And thank you very much, Jen and Miranda. This is wonderful. And I just put a link in the chat for about the conference. I encourage you to tell your colleagues at your institutions to consider coming. I was just thinking that what a wonderful pre-conference workshop we could do if we could get Jen and Miranda to do a half day on playing their games, and then us building our own games, maybe in a team, or if you're bringing a couple of colleagues from your institution. I think it would be just wonderful. So blessings to you all. Have a great rest of the semester. And once again, Jen and Miranda, I'm in your debt. You did a great job, and I've learned a lot today. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for your just interest and participation. We appreciate you. Thanks.
I'll have the